Leaders who fail to recognize the power of culture, their strategies will inevitably fail. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. If strategy is like leading the horse to water, it's the culture that makes people want to drink.
I love that. Is that something that you actively look for when evaluating an investment?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not a venture capitalist by background, but
Kevin Nelis is an advisory principal at True, focused on turning emerging technologies into growth strategies. Previously a senior strategy lead at Accenture, he worked on building and scaling new ventures with major brands.
organizations who are flexible, adaptable, reactive to the market, that'll be the difference between those who are successful and those who are not around anymore. It's not something that you can just like plug into a business. It needs to be grown and watered.
I see what you're getting at, though. Yeah. Hi, Kevin. Thanks for coming on my podcast today. I'm really looking forward to our discussion. I think you have a really great background across venture, consulting, and strategy. I think that gives you a really unique vantage point to discuss what I'm passionate about, which is leadership and talent. So, if you could tell me a little bit more about your background and how that served you in your understanding of talent and leadership in successful companies more broadly.
Thanks for having me on. Thanks, Howard. Nice to chat. So yeah, my name's Kevin Nelis. For around sort of 12 or 13 years now, I've been an advisor to various forms of leadership and business across loads of different industries. So worked across physical infrastructure clients, financial services, telco, tech firms, energy, all of it. It feels like every new project I do is in a new industry. Uh, but the kind of consistency and all that has been giving advice around strategy and technology. How can technology give business leaders or businesses themselves a kind of strategic edge? Is the kind of consistency. I did a few years in, as you mentioned, in kind of corporate venture building. So startups for large successful companies, let's say 100, Fortune 500 companies. You might want to expand into new industries with new products and services, but might not have the skills of starting that little nebulous kind of skill set that is needed to enter a new market fast and scale up. So we'd help them do that for a few years. And then at the minute now, my current role, I'm working with an organization called True. So it's an investment and advisory firm. It's got a VC arm, a private equity arm. And then where I work, which is in the advisory team. So that's, giving advice to executives, mostly within the consumer industry. So mostly around retail and consumer products. And I suppose from all of that kind of experience, what's probably most relevant for our conversation is in all that sort of year, over a decade, given various forms of strategy advice, nothing has maybe made me doubt my belief in that kind of age old adage of, culture eats strategy for breakfast. I believe in it. I subscribe to it a lot. Give strategy advice all day long. I think I can say with a fair deal of confidence that leaders who fail to recognize the power of culture in their organizations, their strategies will inevitably fail. So yeah, that's what I'm sort of passionate about.
Cool. And let's start with that. So, what's your definition of culture?
I think it's one of those kind of concepts that can be very sort of ambiguous and pretty nebulous. I think if we even just say there's a few formal elements, if we just said that the things that contribute to a culture, let's say, and it can be almost anything, right? It could be like who you hire, it could be the values that you subscribe to as an organization, it could be how you set up the office. I think a really, really big one is the ceremonies you choose to have as an organization. Like what is the structure and cadence of it? What's the intention of that ceremony? I think is a really important one. It could be formal stuff like policies, be them formal policies, like written, formal policies of the organization, or kind of a lot of it's the unspoken rules that happen, things like dress code or language or what it means to be a good teammate. There's formal stuff, but it's also almost like and reading in between the lines of what actually makes people tick. If I had to kind of like summarize it, let's say, I think a good way of looking at it, it could be viewed through the lens of anything that contributes to making people want to do something. So like the analogy might be if strategy is like leading the horse to water, it's the culture that makes people want to drink.
Ah, I love that. I
And
haven't heard
you
that
know,
before.
Yeah, you can kind of mandate certain things. You can try to encourage certain behaviors, but it's culture that's going to make people want to behave in a certain way. I think that's the sort of differentiator.
And is it sometimes, like you said, culture is very nebulous and some people equate it to like having a great personality, like you either do or you don't. Do you think it's something that, just happens to a startup, or do you think there are actual levers that leadership can pull to encourage the drinking of water?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think if you're a smaller organization, it's probably easier because it's largely driven by the culture of the founders. It's sort of almost easier to do if there's a small number of people. But nonetheless, there can be kind of quite deliberate actions that leaders can do. And again, it's so wide ranging. I think opening lines of communication is probably the biggest sort of catch all. So, if you're a leader and maybe the kind of leader that sort of tucks themselves away in the corner office and expects sort of the business to kind of run the way you expect it to, that's usually a bad sign. And I think the best leaders at cultivating a conducive culture, what they want to create for sort of business outcomes are those that are open with their lines of communication. They're involved in sort of the ceremonies that they've created. They're active on Slack. They are happy to stand up and talk. They're happy to receive feedback, like personal feedback, as well as feedback on their organization, and creating a culture where folks feel kind of like valued to give their opinion and to be themselves and to be a weird. We're all weird in our own way. That's great. And I think leaders that recognize the value in that and cultivate people expressing themselves is a really healthy thing for folks to do.
Yeah, like really leaning into it. Great. And how could that be something that people continue to work on? As in, if I'm a leader and I agree with what you've said, and it's a lever that I certainly want to cultivate, said, are there actual things that you could do that are tactical in nature for a leader?
Yes, I think I would maybe go back to almost formalizing really healthy lines of communication. So that could look like things like, and this doesn't need to be, leaders in any business don't necessarily need to do all of this themselves. They just need to show that they are recognize the value of it and then maybe delegate it to different people who might be more conducive in creating the cultures that they like. But it's things like having regular kind of temperature check surveys, for example, or kind of pulse check surveys where you're getting a read on. You can do it in a way that people vocalize it themselves, or maybe anonymized, or whatever way you want to do it. But you're making it known to your organization that you're a leader that values the opinions of everyone in the company and that they have something to contribute as the type of culture that they'd like to see. So that's surveys is obviously a classic one. Open forum meetings where it's like the hierarchy of leadership is broken down a little bit and a bit more of a peer relationship. And again, that sets a tone is like, everyone's opinion is validated, I think is a good one. And then a lot of it is around the behaviors that are incentivized. And obviously, like there's monetary kind of commercial incentivization, and that's one part of it. But even just like creating a culture of appreciation for the right behavior. How do you celebrate people? Like as a leader, how are you going to show that you're celebrating people that are demonstrating the right behaviors, even if it's not necessarily like you're the one getting promoted or you're the one getting this bonus or whatever. Celebrating the right behaviors and setting up frameworks that people want to be productive, want to be helping each other out, want to be learning, want to be developing, want to be thinking about the sort of strategic direction of the business. How do you promote that? I think is being really conscious about how you create those structures, I think is something that every leader should sort of lean into.
Is that something that you actively look for when either evaluating an investment or once you have already invested? Is that something that you track, actively manage towards?
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of ways. So I mean, I work very closely with the VC team. I'm not a venture capitalist by background, but I work very closely with them. And, there's a bit of a stereotype, and I think a very true one in the industry, that oftentimes the companies that get invested in, you could say they've got a great product, a great service, a great market fit. That's all fine. But those that are very good at VC work will often tell you they're investing in the founders. So they're investing in the people who've started the business. What is their behaviors? What is their drive? What's their story? Like, what have they failed at? What are the lessons they've learned? And now what makes them the right people to take the business forward? Because you can switch out product offering, you can
Yeah,
develop a new
interesting.
service, you can enter a new market. But like, and fair enough, look, people change. But like, if especially for a small organization, for a young organization, you really want really, really strong leadership, wise, long-term thinking leadership. And so ultimately that's sort of primarily what you're assessing in the
Interesting.
BC decision. And then on the advisory side, where I normally see it is, I think it's kind of just maybe an over indexing in making the right decision from a strategic point of view. So there's this kind of like this idea of where if we can just get all the information, if we can do all the analysis and gather all that data and do all the data science on the market and the product and our customers, and then we'll launch this perfect new product or service with this perfect strategic planning cycle of when that's going to happen. And then well, it's all worked out, then it's all going to happen with very little recognition of like, you might have a plan, but the classic thing is strategy is not a plan, right? It's almost like a framework of rules of thumb. It's a system of principles. And if you're ignoring the principles around what's going to make people actually invested in this strategy, what's going to make people understand it, understand their role in it, be motivated as to why they're part of it in the future, make them take out the fear of the future for them. There's loads of sort of human and psychological elements that are often forgotten in really good strategy. And it's, some 150-page slide deck of perfect graphs and charts and plans and, touch points, and not a huge amount like, how are we actually going to do this? How will folks actually make this happen? So we definitely try to really heavily lean on the kind of cultural and change management elements of any strategy we do.
And I think it's really insightful what you were also saying earlier about how, not word for word, but that the product itself is almost fungible, but not the people. I think that's quite telling.
Yeah.
Um, okay, great. And slightly switching gears here, what if you don't get this right? What if you don't have this vision that it's really about the people that drives the value of the organization or of the success of the organization? What's at stake here if you don't believe that currently?
Yeah. Look, like, not to overstate it, let's say, but I really do think the world we're living in now, or maybe the world we will be living in over the next 10 or 15 years, it will be pretty existential, I think, for a lot of businesses. Like, the difference between getting culture right in the next 10 or 15 years and not is probably whether you're going to be a business in 15 years' time or not. If you just look at like the pace of change that we've seen, it's a classic adage in consulting. Like, pace of change is always increasing, but it seems like it's going to get faster and faster with the dawn of kind of everyone using AI and the disruption that's going to happen at an economic and societal level. And organizations who are like flexible, adaptable, reactive to the market, who bring fresh ideas and can do all that at speed, um, that will be existential. That'll be the difference between those who are successful and those who are not around anymore. And all those things, that sort of flexibility, adaptability, that is all extremely difficult to mandate. It's impossible almost to buy. You can buy it from a technical point of view. You can have partners that scale or that, are flexible contracts and stuff, but ultimately people are still going to be doing it. And there'll be a lot of headcount changes and people's skills will need to change and evolve, but ultimately that's a cultural thing. Being able to be reactive and motivated to drive the company in new directions all the time and be comfortable with that ambiguity of a changing world. That's culture. And it, like I said, it's not something that you can just like plug into a business.
No.
It's something that needs to be, you know, cultivated, right? There's a reason why they call it that sort of, it's same as like horticulture. It needs to be grown and watered before you kind of reap the fruits of it. So I think, yeah, I think it will be pretty existential for folks who get it right over the next 10, 15 years.
Yeah, what I like about what you're saying is usually when I ask that question, it's like, oh, yes, with the advent in AI and industry changes, people will be replaced. But what I feel like you're saying is much more nuanced, which is it's more the fact that with the advent of AI, innovation will happen at a faster pace, and you need people who are able to, like you said, through change management, through all our human capacities to be able to manage that change and absorb that change. So it's not that we need people to change because we're going to get replaced with the advent of AI, but you're saying it's the pace of change and we need people to support the change management in organizations. Is that kind of what
Absolutely, absolutely.
yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
I don't know if I love this terminology, but people often say, it's not AI that'll take your job, it's someone who's using AI. And
Yeah.
I
So
think
I
that's
see what you're getting at though. Yeah.
pretty true. I think there'll be a lot of change, but I do ultimately think, people will still be in the workforce. I'm an optimist. I'm
Me too.
eternal
I hope
optimist.
so.
So, people will still be in the workforce. They'll still be driving the outcomes of businesses. Technology is always changing, but ultimately it'll be the culture of embracing that'll
Okay.
differentiate
Yeah.
sort of successful.
Yeah. Sort of like bracing your team or your company for a storm
Exactly.
and that's a human skill. That's a leadership skill for sure.
Yeah.
Cool. I like that
I
take.
mean, if I'll extend on it just with one analogy,
Yeah.
maybe where
Mhm.
I think we sometimes talk to our clients about this idea that we're seeing, which is what's called a barbell operating model. So if you imagine a barbell where it's like fat on both sides and sun in the middle, and that's effectively saying there'll be two kind of sources of value in your organization. On one side, there'll be technically the ability to react to pretty much anything that happens. So, within HR or finance or supply chain or product, whatever it is, how can you have people who can build the capabilities to be able to react really, really quickly and use technology in a way that facilitates that? Then on the other side, you've got leadership that are very focused on, well, what type of company do we want to be? What role do we want to play in our customers' lives? What will the future look like? Very long term, strategic visioning, purposeful decision makings about the future of the organization. And then all the kind of execution that lives in between that then kind of gets thinned out by technology. It's largely going to be automated. Um, so I think again, I think folks who are able to understand that and kind of react to it, that'll be a big differentiator, I think, going forward.
And what are some of the characteristics you describe to the people who do that leadership part of the barbell well?
There's a kind of maybe a possibilist attitude. There's kind of, I think optimism is a good one. I think whenever you're trying to have quite a long term view of the future, it doesn't really serve you very well to be like thinking quarter to quarter. It's sort of almost a little bit of a fear response, almost like if I don't solve the problem in the next quarter, then like what will that mean for me or what will that mean for the business? And I understand there's a kind of an operational and commercial reality that might make that the case for many businesses. But if that is what your CEO is concerned about, sort of it's not really setting yourself up for long-term success. It's you're in sort of survival mode and like you can only really be in survival mode for a short amount of time really. So I think those that are really good at it are those that are able to almost like slightly rise above that fear response and say future will be better, our organization will be better in the future than it is now. We need to understand what the world will look like and what customers might need and what type of organization we need to be and the skills and culture that we'll need to create and almost be dedicated to that optimistic view of the future, uh, long term view of it, rather than kind of scrambling around and fixing wires that are going to solve the next couple of weeks.
I see it sort of like kind of not being zen, but in a storm. There's a lot of storm analogies today.
Yeah, I mean, he's like, there's a storm coming, there's an AI storm coming, but yeah, we'll need good sailors, What is it? Perfect seas don't make good sailors, right? So,
There you go. I should get that on a plaque somewhere. Okay, so a lot of this stuff, like he says, it's nebulous. It's sometimes it gets put to soft skills when we talk about leadership. How can we capture that somewhere in terms of value when either evaluating an organization or thinking about allocating budgets. Is there a rule of thumb that you give companies that you advise that, like, hey, I know times are tight, and we all are. We know that when times are difficult, that you need to cut costs. Like, when do you tell people, hey, like your L&D budget or coaching or development budget shouldn't be the first to go?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll maybe come at it from two different angles. The the rule of thumb, if you want a rule of thumb that we often quote is, especially now where there's so much investment in technology, new technologies seem like they're
Mhm.
coming out every couple of hours. Adopt. Um, and it is understandable that folks are allocating huge budgets to that. We would err on the side of a little bit more a thoughtful choice around what types of technology you're implementing in your business with what a lot of people would call it 10, 20, 70 rule. So 10% new technology, 20% sort of data and infrastructure that's going to enable data information and underlying infrastructure that's going to enable that new technology, which leaves 70% for all of the other stuff. That's all an element that is new processes, new skills, new communication, new behaviors, um, you know, ceremony, new ways of organizing as people to use the 10% new technology. That's what we've seen the biggest return on investment is whenever you have really choiceful or really thoughtful choices of technology that's backed up by much more investment in how will people do this? What is the process change that's required? What's the new skills that are required? What's the new way we want people to be working with this technology? That's what actually has the better success rate rather than just like pumping, a million new technologies into an organization all at once.
Wow, I hadn't heard that before. That's really interesting.
Yeah. And,
Uh,
and, and one other thing I think just on the kind of measurement of it, I do think it's a little bit of a red herring, I think, to talk about almost like measuring ROI of investment in people. There is lots of ways you could look. There's lots of metrics. Let's say you could look to things like the cost of hiring is probably a good one.
yeah.
So like are folks referring their friends rather than they go through recruiters, for example, or bump up salaries to make the job attractive. Your retention rate. So like what's your labor turnover look like? What's your average tenure of employee is probably a pretty good one. And then sort of going back to what I was mentioning earlier around the change management, ultimately a really good culture that is investing in people will have a much lower cost of change management. The kind of the percentage success rate of change in your organization, like from a new technology or a new service or whatever it is, the percentage of success rate will be higher for those that have invested well in people. So you're kind of saving on these huge, big, multi-million pound transformations because you have taken the time over a pretty long time to embed the right behaviors. So people that are willing to learn and evolve their skills and work with each other and help each other and speak up when they think something's wrong, those are almost like human infrastructure that will allow you to change really quickly as an organization with that technology or new process.
I
Um,
love that human infrastructure.
yeah.
That's good. Do you have any, favorite children in the companies you've worked with where you felt like they did this really well? And what did they do that was unique or maybe even just like an interesting take on their human infrastructure?
Yeah, I could give you clients, and I probably should, as a consultant, I probably should give you clients, but I'm actually going to shout out a previous company of mine that I worked for. And the reason why they were probably the best, they were definitely the best team I've ever worked with. And I kind of joke that I would be very, very lucky to find a better team than them going forward. And I think what it came down to is a real embracing of weirdos is what we call it. Like we want weirdos, a recognition, right? That like everyone is their own individual. Everyone's quirky. Everyone is different. Everyone is inherently illogical.
Okay.
And
Speak
that's
for
what,
yourself. No, I'm
yeah,
just kidding.
and and just like embracing that weirdo-ness, we found to be just like so conducive to good, healthy work environment, but it also just made the work super, super good because folks were coming up with all kinds of crazy ideas all the time. And then there's a kind of natural, like almost natural selection process that happens with ideas, right? Like the terrible ones, get forgotten about, and the ones that are really interesting for some strange, weirdo reason find a way of coming back and being evolved and being built on. And all of a sudden, like, got this new product, this new service, this new way of doing things. So I think leaders that stifle weirdness are doing themselves a big injustice. And I would definitely encourage folks to sort of bring their whole selves to work, express themselves in whatever way they want to, and feel empowered to do that because it's good humanity, it's purposeful and it's healthy mentally, but it's good business.
And it speaks to the point you made earlier about engagement and, like, that's how you get people to drink the water.
Exactly. That's
Yeah.
exactly it. You're getting the horse to drink.
Any other stories?
I don't know, none I can.
Uh, how about, problem children, if you will?
I will mention a client, but I won't mention. But we in the past we've worked with some sort of big FMCG clients, and I think the problem that made them a problem child was I think they were very good at kind of capturing the information that was required. So they were conscious that they needed to make informed decisions. So they would do a lot of analysis. They would, have sort of insight function and kind of gather the necessary information to make a decision. But it wasn't even that they were so risk averse. They were just so action averse. They were so almost unwilling to have the momentum required to do something, potentially fail, learn what they needed to learn from the failure, and then just change it and keep going. So I think,
That's very closely tied to culture, I imagine, and the behaviors
yeah,
associated with innovation and psychological safety and all those things.
definitely it permeated the culture and almost like the bar to informed decision making was just too high. The confidence that was required in order to have action was like 95% confidence, whereas you really want to be getting that down to like 50, it's
Mhm.
almost like just take a risk, work on something, it'll fail, you'll learn, you'll make a better decision next time.
Okay. Cool. Cool. That's consistent with, your favorite child, if you will, which is in the sense that it's the opposite of that. So that makes sense. Cool. Is there anything else that you'd like to share that you think I should know when it comes to looking at an organization and seeing where should I be investing in in talent? How could I make the most of the talent I have? A lot of firms, came to me once and they were just like, look, if I had the budget to get the pick of the litter in this very competitive labor market, that's great, but sometimes I just have to get like 80% good enough or 70% good enough. And I still think I have a really solid team. Do you see that? And how do you get like a team of B players to perform at like an A player level, just given like the realistic constraints of our hiring budgets or anything along those lines?
Yeah, for sure. I definitely believe I've seen a good few stats that show how almost early outlier performers tend to be overtaken, let's say, by more mediocre performers as they go through their career.
So you're
There's
talking
lot
about individuals or investments? Like, yeah.
individuals.
Okay. Yeah.
So for example, like those that come from the top universities or those who have maybe entered the company with like the best education or the greatest grades, or those who performed a more junior role exceptionally well and executed perfectly over time tend to be overtaken by more mediocre performers. And I think again, you could interpret that loads of different ways. I think there's probably a bit of a regression to the mean sort of statistical analysis that could be done there, which is very valid. But I think there's also this element of one of the skills you need to gain is like growth mindset. So if you're naturally very talented and very sort of intelligent and you've sort of entered the workforce as like a star performer, you haven't really gain the skill of the kind of the grit of like being really uncomfortable with having to learn stuff and having to push yourself to adapt to new environments and get stuff wrong and get really harsh feedback. And, it's kind of a bit of a messy process, but that over time pays massive dividends whenever you're able to look back on that experience and teach others about that experience and sort of treat your decisions with a bit more wisdom, having been maybe on the other side of performance. I think it just creates a bit more of a kind of holistic leader. So if you're asking the question, sort of maybe people who don't like have the absolute hugest budgets for investment in people, I think it does come back to, okay, cool. So like what behaviors are you trying to incentivize? How are you creating that kind of human infrastructure that incentivizes people to be continually bettering themselves, bettering each other, sharing knowledge, um, kind of the classic growth mindset stuff, learning new skills, being adaptable, being sort of willing to be better tomorrow than you are today. Um, Ultimately will pay more dividends than thinking you're going to go to Harvard and Cambridge and Oxford, and buy best talent in the world, and then that'll just solve the problem. It's sort of pretty naive.
Yeah, I mean, I think we touched on everything that we wanted to. I just had my last question, which is, what are you most excited about when you think about, in terms of your own career, when you think about like solving the people issue or the human infrastructure issue? What are you interested in trying out, or how are your thoughts evolving in that area?
A couple of things I'm excited about. Let's say one of the things that I'm trying to do a little bit more of, and it's a bit uncomfortable for me because it's sort of maybe it's not my I don't know not my background or not maybe not something that's very mainstream in business. I think the role of ethical business will become way more important than it is today. I think there's lots of elements of business which like, people today might describe as ethical, right? So they'll talk about sustainability, they'll talk about ESG, they'll talk about sort of equity and diversity and inclusion policies. And all of these are great. They're absolutely necessary and they have served us well thus far. But I think there's a sort of a unfortunate reality that a lot of companies just sort of pay them lip service. They think that if they have like an equity and inclusion policy that they've written down and they've published on their website, that they've solved the problem
Nah.
of inclusion in the workplace, or that they have a sustainability policy and so they can just like do whatever they want with their supply chain because they can prove by having a policy that that is good enough. And I think in a world where increasingly almost, I think it's reasonable to expect both power and sort of commercial returns to be pooling, to be kind of converging. And so there might be fewer companies that do more things and are more successful. And I don't necessarily think that's a particularly attractive view of the world, but I think it's reasonably likely. And therefore, what happens is those that are much, much more actually dedicated to being a company that you'd want to buy something from become much more likely to be successful, especially in a world that's much more transparent. The kind of advances in the kind of like information age and, through AI and blockchain and other technologies, the traceability of people's supply chain, for example, of the data driven nature of businesses makes everything like much more transparent. And so it's much easier to like call people out on their bullshit whenever they say, "Oh, we're investing in these things that are ethical." It's like, nah, you're that's lip service. I'd love to explore my own career and like what does that look like where you are challenging leaders to really be bold with a line in the sand. They say, we're going to cap profits. We don't think that earning 100 billion in next year and paying no tax on it is going to be what customers will want. And I'm going to make a call as a leader that I'm going to draw a line in the sand. I'm going to sort of make this for our customers. I'm going to make it conducive to a healthy global environment. And that's what the future of this company is. And then dedicate themselves to making that a reality. I'd love to help leaders think what that will mean.
Sort of leading with an ethical compass,
Yeah.
not purely profit driven.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's huge. Ambitious.
Yeah.
There's a do you know he's a famous podcaster and marketer, Scott Galloway. Are you familiar with him? Anyway, he's a big investor as well, and, he has a podcast, and his new thing now is this movement called Resist and Unsubscribe, and he's encouraging people to, think about companies' practices without naming any of them and either unsubscribe to their services, say, a streaming service or delivery service, and also maybe even having those decisions inform your investment portfolio. So not just as a consumer, but also what you're choosing to invest in. And so maybe that is, whereas before the demand was, I don't know, more goods for cheap or luxury. Now maybe a trend will be demand for products that are ethical, that are from ethically managed companies.
Yeah. I think we're like want to be like sort of almost a very conscious reinvestment of profits. So I think companies that just say we're gonna guarantee that a percentage of our profits, like a chunky percentage, 50% is reinvested into our customers, communities, and livelihood, biodiversity, and sort of the types of issues that folks will look to us and say, I want to buy that product and service, not just because it's a good product and service. And, it's just as good as that other one, but I can guarantee that it's not going to pay for someone's yacht in the Cayman Islands. It's going to a community of art creators in a small town in Mexico, or a sports team in London. It's like that's the type of business that I can imagine in the very long term will be the most competitive because at the end of the day, money only comes from customers and you have to give them a reason to buy from you. So,
No. And if, all products start becoming commodities, these could be differentiating factors for deciding your purchasing. And there's one last thing on that is, are you familiar with the B Corp certification? So
yeah,
I was working with a company that was going through that process at the time, and I believe one of the criteria was, to what extent do you reinvest in the community where you have maybe manufacturing or warehouses. And we were in retail, and I'm sure you're aware, actually, one of the biggest byproducts, like waste byproducts in retail is water. And so being able as a retail company to say that, you actually in the communities in which you manufacture your products, you're actually reinvesting in cleaning water. Like I think that's to me that would be compelling if that could be proven.
yeah, I think that's a great one. It is something that True have. It was one of the kind of things that attracted me to True as an organization. So we're a certified B Corp organization, and it's something that we try to weave into all of our investments. So,
Oh,
if
cool.
we won't invest in things unless they can kind of prove that they've kind of considered a triple bottom line approach. And again, it comes back to that idea of like, it's a much more sustainable way to do business. Um, so just as an example, we've invested in a company recently that uses microbes to create sort of a biodegradable plastic, a natural plastic that can
That's
hopefully
cool.
replace plastic in packaging, for example, in consumer products. So it can break down in 1 or 2 years rather than in one or 2 million years. So
Yeah.
yeah, so that's something we try to weave into all of our investments.
Last question. So, where are you still figuring things out when it comes to assessing talent and leadership quality?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I suppose, I mean, going back to what we spoke about earlier, that it's nice to be kind of keep yourself honest with this type of stuff, and try to challenge your own behaviors, your own kind of biases. So I'd say one thing that and again, I might not sort of articulate it perfectly because again, it's like I say, it's one of the things I'm grappling with, but it's around motivation. So like how we can best motivate people. I love the idea of kind of creating an environment where folks feel as if they sort of create their own motivation, right? So subscribing maybe to the idea that motivation is not something that just happens to you, but it's maybe something you almost like decide to have. And then you maybe take a few steps forward and you do some good work. And then all of a sudden that sort of emotional response comes over you and all of a sudden you are motivated and that sort of is conducive. I think there's that, and the tension I'm sort of trying to work out, let's say, is I've recently become a father.
Oh,
Um,
congratulations.
thank you. It's just great. My little daughter is 1 year old, and
Oh,
it's been brilliant. And I'm super tired, but
nice.
been amazing. And so I've naturally been kind of like thinking about my work and my career and like my kind of interactions that I have with clients, but almost like through now a new lens as a parent. And the analogy I suppose I keep coming back to is like, as every parent will know, it's very easy to give a kid what they want, right? It's very easy to just say whatever they want, you could very easily give it to them. My niece and nephew, if they had the choice, would have like ice cream every single day, every day of their life, but they'll get to like 22 years old and have diabetes, and then they'll be saying, you're a terrible uncle or a terrible. And so I think there's this idea of almost trying to apply the same attitude of a parent, this kind of paternal instinct around what does the balance between trusting people and trusting sort of that they can make their own decisions and look like obviously we're not leading children, right? We're leading super well educated, intelligent, talented, experienced adults, who are wise in their own right and have self determination. Um, but that also recognizing that as humans, as weird, wonderful humans, we are all inherently not always logical. And we often do things that are not in the long term conducive to our own well-being and sort of what's good for us. So I think it's trying to wrestle that tension or that balance between providing the environment that people are motivated and trusting that they'll do their best work because they are motivated to do it versus how you can maybe approach it almost like a bit more of a paternal relationship and say, look, I'm going to try to guide you in the right way here. And I'm not doing it necessarily for, ulterior motives. I genuinely think that if you did it like this, even though you might not want to right now, you'll look back upon it and say, oh, that was actually a really healthy thing for me to do. And that was, with hindsight, that was beneficial for me in my career. But knowing when to do that is very, very, very difficult as a leader. Trying to figure out what that looks like, I think is something I've been grappling with.
Yeah, I think you touch on a lot of things here regarding judgment, stewardship. How do you incentivize people in the business world that, to your point, might have quarterly targets to think long term? Because that's certainly, like you said, a long term point of view. You don't want a 22-year-old diabetic, metaphorically speaking. Um, so yeah, I think those are important skills to maybe even just at a minimum, then like hold as table stakes when looking for leaders, or evaluate, or as a having as a standard when evaluating leaders or coaching leader towards. But yeah, how do you get people to take that on as almost a vocation or a calling,
Yeah.
where
I think where that analogy breaks down, I think in that example of like seeing things through a parent's eyes and being paternalistic, let's say, with those that you're leading, which I appreciate can be sort of seen as very almost like patronizing, and I don't make it come across like that. I think where the analogy breaks down is, like we say, we're not leading children, right? They're adults. I think a really good concept that leaders can almost test themselves against comes from a very famous economics book. I think it was written in like 2000-ish, called Nudge. It was written by a couple
not?
of famous economists, Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein,
Mhm.
who were kind of instrumental in this idea of choice architecture. So, like,
Mhm.
how can we set up the choices that people make in a way that would be conducive to their success? So they were talking about things like how do we get people to invest more in their pension, or how to wear seatbelts, or go to the gym. So these are things that are definitely good for folks, and they would probably say they want to do these things, but they might not do them. So how do we help people do the things that they want to do? And they coined that term, liberal paternalism. And I think the concept, it would be a good one for leaders to sort of remind themselves and almost check themselves against. And what it means is, so the two words, liberal being allowing, like allow people the choice, allow people flexibility, and then paternalism, as in from a parent. And what the way the authors described it is, would the person who's been influenced by this choice, would they themselves, with hindsight, agree that that choice was beneficial for them?
Well, that's a fun
So,
test.
so it's kind of saying, as a leader, can you set your culture up in a way? Can you set your investment in people in a way? Can you set how you challenge people, how you incentivize people, how you motivate people, all of that in such a way that the the people within the organization would look back upon the behaviors that were incentivized 2 or 3 or 10 years ago and say that was beneficial for me, and I am the one who decided that. I think if leaders test themselves against that liberal paternalism, I think we'd have really, really sort of highly motivated, highly capable, again, weirdo people or organizations, and it, again, would be really good for the individual, really good, mentally, but
Yeah.
it can't be really, really good business.
Think you might have started a new movement here.
Hopefully. I'm calling all the parents in the world, that's
Yeah.
it's the parents of the world. Let's see you bring your parenting skills into the workplace.
Yeah. I know we said we were up with that, but, and what do you think the role of boards are in playing that role?
Yeah, I think boards have a massive role to play. I think there's something very important about the external view. Now, conscious boards aren't necessarily always, they're sort of internal, external. For example, the role of like a non-exec director, as an example, which is often at someone that's not really involved in the day-to-day running of the business. It's very healthy test because they can sort of inform the organization about what's happening outside and the different ways of thinking, different business philosophies, different concepts the board themselves or the executive committee might not be thinking about. But again, it's going back to that idea of like open lines of communication. So at all levels, from the people who are freshly into the organization, straight from high school or straight from university, right up to execs, board level, cultivating an environment that people are willing and comfortable and incentivized to share their opinion and be valued for the opinion, even if it's not then implemented, even if it's not taken forward. The fact of just expressing one's opinion and having it debated and having it sort of be judged on its own merit is, exceptionally valuable. It's so important. And it's unfortunately not done as well as it could be in lots and lots of places.
Interesting. Well, I know we're up for time, so thank you again, and lots to noodle on here, and introduced me to a lot of new ideas. And thank you very much.
No problem. Thanks for having me. Yeah, it was really nice to even for myself to have the opportunity to sort of think through some stuff and challenge my own ideas. So yeah,
Good.
it was
Yeah.
really good chatting. Thanks for the time.
Yeah.